Hello and good morning, everyone. Only Positivity here. I have my coffee with me, ready to kick off podcast number 23 on this playlist that I'm looking to launch called Elevated Thoughts. Now, before diving into the book and everything like that, let's go ahead and start with the level set. So, as I endeavor upon pursuing knowledge and life experience in this next phase of life through fitness, photography, traveling, many more things, one habit that I've really formed is reading. So this podcast essentially goes through some of the books I've been reading as of late, taking those lessons learned and applying them to experiences in my life. So, before going into part three of the crime book by Big Ideas Simply Explained, let's go ahead and start with the story for today. So, this story happened about like 10 years ago or so. I just went to my buddy's house. I was still in high school, maybe early college, and I used to hang out with a different group of friends. And one thing we used to do is play a lot of card games, right? And for those of you that recognize the game Mafia, that was one of the main games we used to play back in the day, and it was really fun. For those of you that don't know, it's a game where you kind of have to act things out, right? There's a narrator. I believe the king is the cop. The jack is the mafia, and there's also a doctor in there somewhere as well. I may have botched the rules just now, but essentially, you learn a lot about people because you got to put people on trial. You accuse people of murder and things like that, and people have to defend themselves in front of the jury, right? So you learn a lot about people, and it really makes the most out of the game when you're animated about it. So, every now and then there'd be, a friend of a friend would come. So maybe someone we didn't really know, but, we're very welcoming and, want to include everyone in the game. So, this one particular evening we had like a potluck and it might have been around Thanksgiving, I don't know, but we all brought a dish or appetizer, an entree, right? And then there's a big group of people there, some people I never met, but, we're playing Mafia, we're gonna have a good time. So, flash forward like midway through the game, I um I myself and this other kid are put on trial and we're accused of murder, right? So, at that point, we both have to defend ourselves, right? We have like a minute or two to defend ourselves, and I do my thing, and I like to be very animated throughout this game, and then we have like another couple minutes to kind of do like I don't know if it's a cross examine, but we're having like a debate, right? So this particular kid had brought some enchiladas to the party, right? And one argument that I used as to like vote him off of the game was like, hey man, dude, like look at him. He came in today looking super sketchy with those enchiladas in his hand, right? And that's not even relevant. That's not a valid point of argument. It's just a joke, right? We're messing around. So something about what I said must have really irritated this guy. So um, out of nowhere, he gets super serious. He's like, "Hey, dude, what the hell, man? Like, what's wrong with you?" And I go, "Wait, what? What?" I don't know if he was joking or not, you know. And then I remember this distinctly because it was a weird diss. He goes, "You're trash, man. You're a trash person." And then I just remember it distinctly because he called me trash, and I was like, "Okay, dude, like, I'm sorry." And then my friends that whoever's friend he was there, they go up and dude, they're like, dude, stop. No, no, that's okay. He was just joking. He's just joking. And this guy got all riled up about it. And I was like, okay. So definitely made the vibe weird the rest of the evening. But all I said was he looked sketchy bringing in those enchiladas. So, just a joke. But, it's just funny, right? Like we're playing a card game, and things got out of hand super quickly. I guess we were teasing each other, whatever. But yeah, I just remember being called trash. So whatever about whatever. Okay. So we'll go ahead and move on from that. So, coming back to the book for today, we're going to go through the crime book, part three by Big Ideas Simply Explained. So, what's interesting is, as I've gone through this book, it gives me a different perspective on crime itself. And, crime is a real reaction to people's economic situations and political policy at the time. A lot of times we think, crime are just one-offs, but you can definitely see downward streams based on economic policy and things like that. Or it can be a reaction, right, to oppression or poverty. So, as societies have become more evolved, technology comes into place. The police forces also had to catch up. So you see the evolution of crime in this book as well. So, um, I believe last week we went through con artists, so this week we'll go through white collar crimes. And I don't have too many stories on this one. I think I picked two, mainly because white collar crimes, I don't know if it's right to say, they're a little bit boring to me. So yeah, I just kind of breezed over this one, but there's still a couple of good stories within. So the first story we're going to go through is the story of Charles Ponzi, and that term might sound familiar in relation to the Ponzi scheme, which actually originated from this story. So the pyramid scheme, right? So this took place between 1903 and 1920. Primarily in Boston, Massachusetts, but a few other locations as well. So, a couple things to note at the start. So Ponzi, Charles Ponzi, he didn't start his career off with the idea of conning people in mind, so it seems. So he arrived. He was 21 years old in the United States as an Italian immigrant in 1903. So the book says he arrived with just $2.50 in his pocket, right? So meager means definitely set up for a tough life in America. So coming back to reality for a second, right? So a lot of immigrants, they come to this country back in the early 1900s, through Ellis Island, and they really wanted to make a name for themselves here, right? Their legacy was very important to them as they came to America, and family name meant a lot as well back then, right? Carrying on the family name. Where, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I don't know if that is, important to me as a legacy, but, it definitely seems like a solid theme throughout the immigrant population coming to America and settling. So anyway, so Charles Ponzi was broke, so he's determined to make a name for himself, get some wealth, and get things moving, right? So he picked up English really, really quickly, right? He was an Italian immigrant, only spoke Italian, picked up English super fast, super quick. So um, another theme of what we saw with criminals in terms of Victor Lustig, right? Conning people into buying the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. He picked up a bunch of European languages immediately or quickly, right? So you see these themes of, I guess sociopaths being pathological, adapting to their environments and things like that. So he also moved around the East Coast a little bit, Charles Ponzi, and he took up various jobs there. And additionally, he was a waiter and he became a translator. So he was really able to, adapt, like I said, to his environment. He moved to Montreal in 1907 and got a job at a bank, and he quickly became a bank manager there, right? So, like I said, in being able to embed himself in the environment and succeed. So, just based on what I'm saying here, you can tell that Charles Ponzi really does have ambitions. And as you look closer, you can tell that he had very, very high aspirations. So when he becomes that bank manager, I believe this is his first instance of crime. So um, the bank he worked at in Montreal failed, and then Ponzi, right, became desperate, really looking for a way to make ends meet. And, when you put someone in a desperate circumstance, there's really no telling what they're going to resort to make ends meet. So, like I said, crime is a reaction to an economic circumstance. And, I don't know Charles Ponzi, I didn't know him, but I'm sure he wasn't just trying to break the law for the sake of breaking the law at first. He was probably just looking for a way to survive. So what he did was he wrote himself a forged check just to get enough funds to go back to the United States. And he was caught and he spent 3 years in jail. Now, jail is going to change someone, right? So he spent a significant amount of time there. Um, and it just seems like he's having a tough time of it ever since he arrived in North America. And, in my earlier podcasts, I talk about how, the American dream is not always what it seems, right? People come here, they think they're going to have the best life ever, but it can often be tough as well. So Charles Ponzi moves to Atlanta and he spends another 2 years in prison for smuggling immigrants into the country. So now, this guy who had high aspirations when he came at 21 years old, right, to make a name for himself in America, has spent 5 years in jail and has been on the brink of bankruptcy probably multiple times, right? So, um, like I said, he it seems like these events led him to become this con artist or to become this white collar criminal. So once he got released from prison in Atlanta, he returned to Boston and he got married in 1918. So he worked some odd jobs there and tried out some new ventures, but they failed. And then he became desperate again. So you're right, this guy's down on his luck. So at some point, the bulk of the story comes in here. So Charles Ponzi receives a letter from Spain, and this is where the Ponzi scheme originates. So at that time, right, in 1918, there was a method to send international postage, and it was called an international reply coupon. So somewhat of a stamp, right? So what Ponzi realized shortly was that he could buy stamps from Italy and sell them for a profit in America. There was a price discrepancy, right? So that's called arbitrage. And you can tell this guy's looking, right? Looking for opportunities, even with a postage stamp. So um, what Ponzi then did was he applied for a loan and he asked his family in Italy to start buying up postal coupons like crazy and then send them to America. So, one quick note on that is that this was not illegal at the time. Everything he was doing at that moment was legal. He's just buying low and selling high. It's a basic principle. So what he was trying to figure out though was how was he going to redeem these coupons for cash? Okay, so there was no way for him to monetize that arbitrage. So what he did was he found a list of investors and he told them that he could double their investment in 90 days. So a lot of investors were paid what he promised them, but this is where the pyramid scheme comes into play. So he paid off earlier investors with the new investor money, right? So the people who had initially invested got their money back as the new investors would come in, and that was a cycle that kept happening and happening and happening. And to make it seem like it was legitimate profit, Ponzi opened up a company, and this caught wind, right? And investors just started rolling in after that point. So there at this point there seemed to be no intention for Ponzi to generate any legitimate profits or legal profits. So the book says at some point he stopped buying the coupons altogether and he kept all the money for himself. So flash forward to 1920, he made over $2.5 million, which would be equivalent to 30 million today, from about 8,000 customers. So he had a very big investment base. And since business seemed to be booming at this point, and people were getting their ROIs or the return on investment, investors started mortgaging their homes and invested their life savings in that business. Um, and a lot of people didn't even take profits out of the business from Charles Ponzi. They would just reinvest it right back into it. Um, and right here is where you can tell that Ponzi lacked some general empathy. So he was seeing people pour their life savings and their houses and their futures into this fake venture, and he let that happen without any remorse, right? Any guilt. And Ponzi would go as far as offering them 50 to 100% ROI after only a few days, and this made the uptake even higher. And for those of you that are keen on investment ROIs and things like that, 50, 100%, these things are very high numbers, right? It's a very high promise that he's giving these investors. So, sure enough, right? Charles Ponzi developed a life of luxury. Bought a nice mansion. He would smoke cigars publicly from diamond cigar holders. Bought a lot of gold-handed canes and would walk around town with them. So, he's getting too carried away here, right? Making too much noise with his money. And we see that with like even the mob movies, right? So whenever there's a big heist or there's a big score, they say don't spend your money for a little bit, right? You want to attract attention, and that's exactly what Ponzi did, though. So, um, even though Ponzi's scheme here was operating at a huge loss, he was getting more investors. Um, but every time he got more investors, he's incurring more loss because he's paying old investors with new investor money. And so the bubble's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, by 1920, he was making $250,000 a day, which is about 3 million pounds. Um, so, so ultimately, some holes started getting poked into his little theory here or his little scheme. So a furniture dealer had went to the authorities because one of Ponzi's checks had bounced, right? One of his dividend checks had bounced, and this is where the investigation began. So after that, it came to light that Charles Ponzi wasn't even investing in his own company. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts got involved at this point, and Charles Ponzi went ahead and said, "Hey, look, you know what? I am not doing anything illegal here, um, and I won't accept any new customers while you conduct your investigation." And so, the ball's on the guy right here, right? He's super audacious, if you will, right? He has confidence in his scheme, right? I think he thought that his confidence alone would carry him through, right? Just some details related to his narcissism right there. So ultimately, at some point, the Commonwealth took a look at his quote unquote books or his writer's accounting, and all it was just a Rolodex of investor names, right? So he wasn't keeping track of anything or issuing invoices on anything, just a Rolodex of note cards with investor contact information. So, flash forward, the US Post Office comes forward and says in the newspapers that there's no way this could be real because there wasn't even enough coupons in circulation for this to be true in any regard. And then, going a step further, Charles Ponzi was pissed and he filed a lawsuit against the US Post Office. Um, and that to me is baffling, right? You know you're lying at this point, but you're gonna go up against a major corporation, knowing full well that your whole scheme is full of shit, right? Super sociopathic at this point. So, in late 1920, people stopped believing in his schemes and they started inquiring about pulling out their money. And then Ponzi couldn't get that money soon enough to pay off all the investors, and he pretty much knew he was going to be arrested. So he's lying, he's lying, he's lying, and now it's catching up to him. So ultimately, he was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud. Um, so what that amounts to is, so he lost about $20 million worth of investor money, but he was able to pay, about what was it, like 70% of it. He was $7 million short. But one thing about this guy, I'll give it to him. He recouped $13 million. So he wasn't stupid, right? He probably had some kind of order to it, but ultimately illegal activity is going to get you caught, and you're going to get thrown in jail. So he also made about six major banks fail, right? And this is how we talk about like a bubble, like an economic bubble forming. So people are pulling out all of their life savings from the banks. Um, they're pulling out all of their investments and putting it into this business. So the banks are they're not liquid anymore. And once this money is gone, those banks fail, right? People were receiving 30 cents on the dollar for what they invested. So 70% loss there, which is crazy. Um, so Ponzi was in jail, but he got out on bail and he fled. He went to Florida before sentencing. So he got down there and set up another pyramid scheme, right, called the Sharpon Land Syndicate. And essentially what he did there was he sold swampland to investors and promised them a big return, right? So once again, finding the opportunity in anything. And in some ways that's a gift, right? So he was caught there, sentenced to a year in prison, and he got out on appeal. So he heads to New Orleans at this point, trying to flee the country and go back to Italy. But they caught him, and he served his remaining sentence in Boston and then returned to Italy. He tried out some more shit over there, right? He tried out some more scams in Italy um, that failed, went to jail in Italy, and he went to Brazil and he died in 1948. So he was about 65. That's a really sad story, right? So the guy just had a hard life, and the rest of his life he just spent scheming people, right? Maybe he felt that the system had done him an injustice, so he was going to do that to people, right? Um, and you talk about some of the damages to the economy here, right? When people do these schemes, it diverts money away from legitimate investments and legitimate markets and businesses. And Ponzi schemes are really hard to identify because they use a lot of technical language, they use a lot of jargon, and I have a really concrete example of that. So I get approached on LinkedIn, Facebook from, people who are quote unquote entrepreneurs all the time. They claim to have, $1 million businesses and things like that. A couple once approached me on LinkedIn, and they said, are you interested in mentorship or side income? And, of course, right? That all sounds good. So I said, hey, look, yeah, I'm definitely interested. I have a good job, but, always good to diversify yourself, hedge your risk. So they meet up with me, right? We meet up at like a Panera or a coffee shop, and we just start talking. They gave me a book to read. I read the book. It was called like Business of the 21st Century, by this like real estate tycoon, like some Asian guy, right? I forget his name. Um, so what's interesting about that book, right, not to get too deep into the details here, is that the author, is telling you all about a different way to make money, like, automation and things like that. But he made all his money as a real estate tycoon, right? So it's like, how can you talk about this when you didn't even make your money from that, right? So anyway, um, so this couple, right, that approached me, they're like they would host these sessions downtown at the Ritz-Carlton, right? Make it appear like they're really wealthy and things like that. Um, and so when you would ask the other people at these meetings if the system worked, they would be super enthusiastic about it, right? Like, yes, it works. I'm able to do so much. I feel so good about my life. I'm in control finally. And so when you ask them, like, how much money have you made in the past 2 years, right, since you started? They would be like, hey, it's not about the money. It's about financial freedom. And I'm like, well, dude, like financial freedom has everything to do with money and wealth. So I don't know. So, I go forward with this couple and like, we're talking, where, they're making me read books. I'm checking it off with them. And I just want to see what their thing was all about, right? So, I'm going through these loops. I'm meeting with people. I'm talking to people. All good. All good things. I was reading a lot. I was networking. So they quote unquote accepted me into their partnership and their mentorship. So what that meant was, I had to sign up for a subscription to receive like all of my groceries and my products, my hair care products or my, toiletries, through this website, right? And they were all overpriced. None of the normal brands I used. The membership was like $75 a month. I had to sign up for this like platform that was also another like 30, $40 a month. Um, and I would only make money once I signed other people up, right? And that was kind of weird too. And but like one thing that kind of was a nail in the coffin for me, saying like, I'm done with this. I think you guys are like kind of scheming here or scamming me. So we're at one of these events and they're like kind of being like the keynote speaker, right? And they're like starting to talk about how much money they have, right? So one guy goes, um, I like to have a lot of money. I like to be cash heavy. He goes, I have $100,000 in my bank account at all times. And I go, okay, I heard that, cool. So after he's done, I go, hey, can I see? And can I see? You said like you have $100,000 in your bank account at all times. You want to show me? And he goes, oh, actually, I got to do this right now. And then he got really vague, right? Um, and these people claim that they're millionaires, right? I'm like, can you show me anything that shows me that you're a millionaire, right? Or how about this? How about this? How about if you're so confident in your system, how about you front all the costs for it, right? You say, I'll pay for your membership, I'll pay for this, I'll pay for your travel to go there, and then I'll be like, well, as soon as I get $1 million, I'll give you that money back, man. I'll give you all that, maybe plus more, right? And they weren't willing to do that either, right? Not to get too windy on this path here, but I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast with Naval Ravikant, who's a smart dude, right? Extremely intellectual. He said one thing. He goes, if it actually works, you should be able to show it for free. And I totally understand that, right? You should be able to show someone for free that it does work, or you should be able to be as transparent with the details, if you truly believe that it works, and in fact it does, right? So yeah, right? You got to be careful with the pyramid schemes, but they exist, right? And these days they're going to coerce people into like, side income and things like that. And it sounds really good, financial freedom, all that stuff, but be wary, right? Go forward with caution. So anyway, enough on that one. So that was Charles Ponzi in relation to the Ponzi scheme. So That's it for that story. But we got one more story for today, and that's going to be the Bhopal disaster that occurred in Madhya Pradesh, India, in 1984. So this is more of a, like corporate negligence, I'd say, than maybe a white collar crime, but they were charged, so I guess it can be classified in that way. So um, just kind of like making an illustration for you. So in December 1984, there was 40 tons of methyl isocyanate leaked from a pesticide plant that was owned by a U.S. firm called United Carbine Corporation, UCC. So 500,000 people in this village or this little town were exposed to that gas. So there was a very toxic cloud that kind of took over the city. And there's no exact number of people who died in that calamity, but it was said that thousands of people had died instantly, right? Thousands of people died on contact from being exposed to this gas. So, um, thousands more were left with continuous, permanent, debilitating disabilities. And at the time, right, in 1984, this was the worst industrial accident in all of history. So, just kind of like level setting with you guys there. So, start with a little bit of the backstory. So, this plant was built in 1969, and it was built to produce this pesticide called Sevin, Sevin. And that was used widely throughout Asia for, pest control and things like that. And another very important detail is that the Indian government had about 49% stake in this operation, right? So just painting the picture there. So there was also early signs of some negligence, okay? So they chose this place called Bhopal because it had a really good transportation structure, okay? So, you're dealing with potentially harmful chemicals, you're exporting and things like that. It's going to be good to be in a very specific location that's suited for this type of activity. And the distribution channels are going to mean a lot. So, this plant, however, it was zoned and built for light industrial use and was really not capable of dealing with an industry that had potential hazards like this one. So I'm sure someone up top was like, "Hey, this is cool, all good, right? It won't matter." It's direct negligence right there. Um, so, uh, in terms of production itself, they were only supposed to produce pesticides, okay? And they were supposed to get the chemical mixture from a third party. But, to cut cost, they produce those chemicals in-house, which is a very dangerous process. And once again, some negligence there. Didn't seem like they understood the risk. Um, so, and we see this a lot with American corporations, but this plant was utilized and utilize safety equipment and protocols that were very far below the standards that were maintained in the US. So, we see that in a lot of outsourced scenarios where, products that are made in China, for example, um, are made in plants where there's terrible working conditions, and the workers are severely underpaid. So, it seems like India was aware of these issues, but they kind of feared that economic impact of closing down a plant of that size. And like I said, they had a huge stake in that operation, and they didn't want to see it fail. So, flash forward to the day of the event. So that's December 2nd through 3rd of 1984. So there was a faulty valve situation that occurred, and we'll get into that in a minute. But so once the gas leak occurred, a strong wind blew it through the city, and it stuck to the ground. It went through the city, and as people inhaled it, their throats and eyes burned, and people died terrible deaths, foaming at the mouth, and vomiting uncontrollably. The chief minister of Madhya Pradesh was really was knocked, right, for fleeing the city, and he left his residents just to kind of fend for themselves. So we go forward to the post incident investigation. So the CEO of UCC flew out from America to India with a technical team to help manage the chaos. And when he did arrive, he was placed under house arrest. And he had to take some responsibility, so they didn't want him, intervening in the investigation in case he tried to cover something up. So they put together a task force to investigate, and they delivered medical supplies to the area to try to, put a band-aid on this whole situation. So when that task force got there, they rolled into a very horrific scene. So the streets were filled with dead, decaying bodies and dead animals. And I can imagine that being super traumatizing to witness. So they release the CEO on the condition that he comes back to India for trial. And what I think the biggest piece of bullshit in this whole story is that the UCC at first gave $120,000 for relief for the situation. So, this was in 1984, so $120,000 probably went further, but $120,000 is nothing in comparison to the lives of thousands of people. So that was I don't know who came up with that figure. So I think they got a lot of flack for that. So, a year or two later, that fund increased to about 7 million. Still not enough, but more substantial. So this investigation lasts for years and years and years, even till recently, to be honest. So um, the actual situation that happened was that 1 ton of water that was meant for like cleaning pipes in the factory and things like that in the lab, it was mixed with 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, and that caused a chemical reaction and that forced that valve to open and let the gas escape. So investigators say that it was employee sabotage that caused this, and the UCC was forced to pay $470 million in damages at that point. But people still feel, and I agree, that uh, UCC significantly underestimated the long-term effects of this disaster, right? So in 2001, right, 20 years after the event happened, they built a hospital to treat victims. 20 years later, and 20 years later, they established a health insurance fund to cover the medical costs of 100,000 people. Right? I'm gonna reiterate, 20 years later. So there's chronically ill survivors that are still experiencing negative affliction 20 years later. And now in 2010, almost 30 years later, 7 former execs of UCC, who were all Indian nationals by the way, were convicted of causing death by negligence. And another kicker is that they only had to pay $2,000 each, and they served 2 years in prison each, right? Um, and we talk about the ongoing issues. There was a large number of children born after the disaster that suffered severe mental and physical deformities. And, I'm not sure as to the correlation, but it has to be correlated in some way. So, some real examples of corporate negligence here, what people will do to cut costs, raise profit, and things like that at the cost of lives, right? We see that all over the world. But that's all I had for you guys today, right? So short on the white collar crimes here. I hope you guys are enjoying the podcast. Feel free to leave me any comments, and remember, only positivity. Thanks, guys.